Vijay, thanks so much for taking a few minutes. I appreciate it. Now, grew up in Fairport, started on the violin, maybe was going to become a physicist, self-taught pianist, now professor at Harvard, MacArthur Fellow recipient, and likely puts his shoes on one at a time. We'll get to all that in just a moment. The first thing I wanted to ask, in the research that I was able to find, is it true that this is your first official visit back to the Rochester area since you came to the Jazz Festival in 2014? I'm sure your parents still live around here, but is this the first time you've been officially back since then?
I think it's my first public appearance in several years in Rochester. Yeah. So
Yeah.
of course, it's a very different kind of appearance than what I did last time. But it's all connected for me. So, but yes, it's a nice chance to reconnect with the community. It's been a while.
Yeah. What about Rochester for you was, really formative? Obviously, you had a chance when you were working in Fairport, which all of our public schools have really good arts programs, and, being at Eastman. You've gone on to do, so much, but, in what way does still coming from Rochester still sort of serve as a creative touchstone for you?
I suppose I think about all the experiences I had making music with people. It's a very musical town. It's with Eastman and the RPO and RPYO. And the high school I went to had a great music program. It's a public high school in Fairport. And so I had music in my life every day, and it was just normal to be that way. I was in a rock band in high school. I got to be in the jazz ensemble. I was in the orchestra. So I was always among people making music. It was not just a solitary pursuit. And so I think that just set me up in a way to think about music a little bit differently, and to just feel it as kind of a natural part of being alive. And I was a bit of a late bloomer in terms of choosing a path in music for my life. I didn't really make that choice until I was 23, well after I had graduated from college and pursued a couple other things first, and so coming back around to that, and I felt like I had a good, really strong foundation, and so I was fortunate in that way.
Cool. So I do want to get to some of those ideas in just a second, but I want to ask about this because I feel like it'll set the tone really well for the rest of the interview. This lecture you're doing, obviously the last time you were here was to perform at the Jazz Festival. I think you had a full band set and then a solo set at Hatch, if I remember correctly. But the title of this lecture is Musicality. That's obviously a very broad concept, and it is a lecture, so in some ways it's very pointed, in other ways it's very broad. Just because I think it'll set the scene, why don't you kind of give us a sense of what this lecture will be about? What are you going to be trying to convey to the students and the faculty that might be there?
It's to pose some questions about how we think about and talk about musical experience. Musicality is one of those sort of slippery words. It's the sort of thing that anybody, musician or not, has an opinion about. What is musical to you? Which is not the same as how do you define music. It's more like what feels musical, what feels like music, what gives you that feeling. And often, in particular, the way musicians talk about it, the way musicians tend to use that word, it's rare, actually. There's a lot of music to go around, but truly musical moments or musical performances or musical individuals, those are few and far between. So there's some special quality that we ascribe to those beings or those experiences that we categorize as musical. So part of this line of inquiry, or just a set of questions I have, is to open that up, to get people to talk about that in more detail. And there's, you might ask why bother? Part of my agenda here is to kind of answer back to a certain community of scientists who talk about music. There's a research field called music perception, music cognition. Cognitive scientists, neuroscientists, psychologists studying, and also evolutionary biologists, sort of importantly, studying this thing that humans do that called music, or a thing that humans like is the way they tend to talk about it. Is like, why do human beings like music? As if to forget that it's also that thing that we do, and so I'm trying to like see the way that scientists use this term. They'll often say they'll talk about the human capacity for music making. They'll call that capacity musicality. And so that means that it's this species-wide quality. Musicality is something that human beings have inherently. So that's strangely at odds with what I just said about what musicians think musicality is. How can it be both ubiquitous and rare? What does that mean? So there's something about that, what that word is doing, that offers us an opportunity to ask some questions. And the other side of this that's important for me is that I've been part of a community of musicians who often find themselves on the edge of the category of what music is, particularly all these revolutionary Black experimental musicians of the last century. I just got off stage this past weekend. I did 6 concerts with 3 octogenarians, Reggie Workman, Oliver Lake, and Andrew Cyrille. And they're legends of this music. And we were playing a jazz at Lincoln Center. And I found that they could take us to the brink of what we thought music was. This is the sort of experience I have had time and again with musicians of that lineage, especially of that generation, but across the board, even young musicians who are pushing the envelope of what we think music should be or could be or has been. When we think about like the fact that so much music that we hear now is made with machines, with digital machines, with drum machines, samplers, made in a computer. That was unimaginable 50 years ago, and the fact that that has become the sort of undercurrent of our musical lives now is kind of remarkable. So this is what I mean by like the edge of what we think music is. And so it's something about how previously unmusical act or sound or a set of sounds or object or person becomes musical. So that's the question I would like to ask, because I find myself in that space so much of the time as an artist. It's like, how does non-music become musical?
Yeah, there's a lot to tackle there, but a couple of things I pulled from that. You used this phrase, which I thought was really interesting, which was, it is both ubiquitous and rare. And in listening to you talk about that, I'm hearing some other things about how music is participatory, right? Where, there may be a very small select of musicians, when you talk about the rare part, who might be able to play at that level, but it's ubiquitous in the sense that we can all enjoy it, take it in, and be a part of that experience. And I think the other thing you mentioned when you're talking about when we're transitioning from maybe, live music to creating music off a computer, so much of how we define what is music or what is musicality is really based on what we ingest, what we take in. And 50 years ago, we weren't taking in anything on one of these, right? I mean, we sent people to the moon with less processing power than what's in these. And
That's
so that really changes our sense of, musicality. And I think it takes into this big part of what we take in. And I think if you look at your discography, which is, kind of a bit of a cheat code into looking at what you're taking in and then, what you're putting out there, it's everything that combines some Southeast Asian music. It combines, maybe some straight ahead standards with your own take on it. It combines your own compositions. It's working with hip hop artists. I mean, how do you, as someone with all of these different backgrounds, with science, violin, jazz, piano, composition, social awareness, how do you think about musicality? How do you try to pose these questions to take all this stuff in and put something out there that is participatory and kind of touches on a lot of these things that we talk about? It's one thing to ask a questions, which you do so eloquently, but how do you go about this own process with those things in mind?
I'm going to answer with a question, but not to be elusive, just to, I think it'll help us get at maybe what matters to me. I often ask my students, what does listening sound like? Which sounds like it's one of these Zen koan type things where you don't think there's an answer, but you also know what not listening sounds like. You can tell when someone's ignoring you, like when you're talking to them and they're not in sync with you, they're not in tune with you, or if you're talking to a crowd and they're not, even if they're not making noise, you can tell that they're not with you. Even just by how they breathe, they're not in it with you. So what is that? What's the opposite? What does it sound like and feel like to listen and be heard? And this is because this is what musicians need to consider when they're part of an ensemble, right? And why does that matter? It's because when we listen from the outside, as you know, I've listened to music my whole life. I've been to thousands and thousands of concerts, I've played thousands of concerts. What matters to me, at least as a listener, is feeling like my presence matters, that I'm being addressed somehow directly, or that there's a kind of ethic among the performers of taking care of each other and of the music, and by extension of all of us in the audience. So it's a question I think about a lot, which is something that the clarinetist and composer Don Byron often posed, which is, how do you take care of the listener? As a composer, how do you do that? How do you carry them through an experience? Or as a music maker on stage, as a performer who is trying to deliver something, trying to communicate something, and trying to really make it stick, make it matter to somebody. And so that's the question that pervades all of my work, I would say, as a music maker. Is like, how do I, well, those two questions, like both what does listening sound like, and then how do I take care of the listener?
I think that is a good transition into something else I wanted to touch on. Wrapped up a handful of years ago now, but you basically had a little trilogy of recordings with Mike Ladd, hip hop artist and producer, and in that you discussed a lot of social issues. And I think the last one of those came out in 2015 through around 2017, I believe. I think 2015 might have been the last one.
2013 actually was the
2013. So even
we performed together many times since then, but that album, Holding It Down, the Veterans Dreams Project, came out in 2013.
Obviously, the world is quite different than what it was in 2013. And as someone who is looking to take care of the listener and to be informed, those touched on contemporary themes. And I think what our contemporary themes are a little bit different than that. I think Breakthrough kind of touched upon this, and even just looking at the title alone of Uneasy, your 2021 release, it seems like you're going more towards in that direction. And so when you're trying to take in not just musical information, but societal information, what are you feeling? How do you apply that to the music? And then how are you trying to communicate that to a listener? Because we do see this trajectory in some of the stuff that you're doing, and you're trying to communicate these themes to a listener. How do you do that in an age where sometimes it's harder for people to communicate. There's sort of a higher baseline level of anxiousness. How do you do that?
Um, I wouldn't say that I'm more political now than I was 20 years ago. I think it's the same amount, but maybe, and you know, I use the number 20 for a reason, and that's because I've lived in New York City since 1998, and you know, so I was there on September 11th, and I was there living through the aftermath of that. Not just the aftermath of the attacks, but the general response, and particularly what that did to communities of color. Uh, you know, the surveillance, the anxiety, the hate crimes, the immigration roundups, and then living under a racialized, quote unquote, war on terror, war on a feeling, you know, that seemed to implicate all brown people. As someone who was born and raised in the US, you know, like what did that then mean for me as an American to live under that every day? And when I look back at the last 20 years of what I've done, you know, I've been making albums since 1995, but literally everything I've done since that moment was touched by it, you know, is affected by it, is about it somehow. Um, and again, not just the attacks, but what did the state do in response, and what did the people around us who we thought were our fellow citizens do to us, or how did they treat us? And I remember my dear friend, the late great Greg Tate, who just passed away last month. I remember he said to me at that moment, he's an African American critic and musician. He said to me in that moment, "Well, welcome to racial profiling." So it was a reality that I hadn't really known growing up, even in Fairport. I mean, I was one of the few brown kids in Fairport High School. I didn't really know what that meant in the larger context. I didn't know why I was one of the only ones at the time. I didn't have a historical framework to understand that, you know. It was only later that I understood that there had been a change in immigration law in the 60s that led to a lot of non-Western immigrants coming over, like my parents, who then had kids like us. So that was what happened. You know, we were curated into existence by the US government. And then what did that do? How did the general population respond to us? Like, what did it mean for us to be American too? How did we figure out how to be American? And was that the right goal for us, you know? And so for me as an artist, that was what I've always been like kind of addressing and working through, for myself, you know, and among others and with others who want to ask those questions with me. That's been true since the very beginning, you know, since 1995, but then it became much more intense 20 years ago. And so that set of questions has animated everything I've done and everyone I've, you know, it's been the reason I've made music with the people I've made music with, people of all stripes, of course. But that's been a motivating force, is like trying to make sense of my place in the world and trying to find people who will join me in that quest, and then finding audiences for whom that resonates.
That's a beautiful thing. That's actually one of the things I wanted to ask about. Some of your frequent collaborators include Stefan Crump, Tyshawn Sorey, some of these cats who are really known for this kind of thinking. So that is something I wanted to ask about. I wanted to pivot, you know, just a little bit. We mentioned off the top here, started learning violin when you were very young, and then the sight of your sister's piano inspired you to start tickling the ivories just a little bit and experiment. And so some part of what you do is self-taught. And as someone who has done a lot of self-teaching over the years, trying to, learn new skills, I'm always curious. It's always interesting to me to see how some of the processes I have might be different from some of the things that other have. And that way, that gives me different strengths, different weaknesses, or a different way of, looking at things. So this entire interview has been pretty introspective, but this one I'm really asking about your process. Being more of a taught musician and someone who's a piano player and taking all of this in, how have you found that being self-taught on the instrument? We've talked a lot about the theory of things, or the general concepts of music, or the message, but specifically on the instrument, what do you think being self-taught has influenced or made a mark on how you are as a piano player?
Well, as a pianist, it's made everything feel like ketchup, like, oh gosh, I sure don't know how to do that. I had to hear somebody play something and be like, how in the world is that even humanly possible? So it's been humbling, most of all, to be around truly virtuosic, I've known some of the greatest pianists in the world, got to know Gonzalo Rubalcaba, Craig Taborn, uh, Conrad Tao. There's like a lot of folks out there who are just on the cutting edge of what's possible on the instrument. Corey Smythe is another one. And then I've found myself making music with some of those people, like in two piano settings or something. And understanding that, well, I have something else to offer that's not, it just is what it is. I certainly am always trying to be better, and having contact with good pianos has made a huge difference to me, and I now have a really excellent piano in the house. It's a kind of a blessing that just sort of fell into my life recently. So that actually, when you get to do that, because like I remember my earliest memories on the piano are on my sister's Baldwin Spinet. That was like, it was just a beat up, modest instrument. There was only so far you could push it. There's only so much nuance you could milk out of it. Not that I was all about nuance at age 3 or anything, but when you get access to an instrument that has all these other dimensions of subtlety, then I'll never forget, like, I was doing a solo piano tour in I think it was 2010, because that was when I released my first solo piano album, which I felt very self-conscious about. And then I was doing this tour in Europe, and I played at Beethoven House in Bonn, Germany, which is like where his archives are housed. And it's kind of a legendary place. But they have one of I still remember that piano. It's like one of the best pianos I've ever played. And when I say best, I mean, it takes you somewhere you didn't know was possible, And so I can hear, there's actually they recorded that concert for the radio. And so I can hear myself in those moments finding out what a piano has to offer. That, like, it kind of almost stopped me in my tracks. I was like, oh, I see. And so communing with that, like, and then the other thing is that happened in the context of performance. So then I still have the responsibility of communicating, channeling, making it matter, not just to myself, but to everyone in the room, and taking care of the listener. So it's often in the context of performance that you have these breakthroughs. And the last thing I'll say about it is that it's not purely that I was self-taught. It's that I had many, many opportunities to apprentice with elder musicians in the context of performance. It was really on the bandstand that I did the most learning, and still do to this day. What I was just saying earlier about what happened this past weekend with those legends of music, with those octogenarian visionaries. um, that was a huge learning experience for me, and I've played with them for years. I that was not my first time. I've played with them since 2013. So they still brought me to a new place, and so that's where a lot of that discovery and breakthrough and growth happens in the context of performance, which means in the context of others. Both making music with people and making it for people.
That brought us beautifully full circle with the idea of musicality. So we put a nice little bow on that. And there are a couple more things that I want to talk about, since I do want to be respectful of your time, of course. New project. I got that little tip from your team who passed that along, what you're working on right now. I know nothing about it. So feel free to discuss if you're working on something new, if you want to pitch it. Now's the time.
I'm always working on a lot of things. Like right now, I'm I'm in my office at Harvard, although I don't live here, and I've actually been on leave this year on sabbatical. So I've been in New York in fact, the last 2 years since the pandemic started. But I'm here to record something with a string quartet, the great Parker Quartet, who are in residence here at Harvard. So they're my colleagues here. I just wrote a piece for them. It's called Room for Ghosts. And but the other thing is that the trio that recorded Uneasy, we've been developing a lot since then. We've had dozens of performances and have many more to come. And so we're slated to record in a few months. Not sure when that'll be out. And then the other thing, well, a couple other things. I am active as a composer. I work a lot with classical musicians now, and so I'm writing a cello concerto that will premiere in October in London. And then I have this recording in the works with the great vocalist Arooj Aftab, who you may recognize her name because she's nominated for a Grammy for Best New Artist. She's pretty phenomenal. I've been working with her for some years, and she had a real breakthrough last year with her own project. So we have a recording in the works that might be out this fall if all goes well.
Wonderful. All right, Vijay, we are at this time where I call them the big three. They are, big picture questions. They're kind of general. Given your time constraint, you can be as liberal with your time or as constricted with your time as you'd like it. Does not matter to me. I appreciate what you have to say. We led our interview off with talking about how Rochester was foundational. Obviously, you're a little bit younger then. Now that you're older, you've had a chance to be more worldly, work with all these musicians, live in different places. Looking back on it, and at the times you've been able to visit professionally, whether it's playing, lecturing, or even visiting your folks, as I'm sure you do from time to time, we talked about that it was a chance for musicians to play together and foundational for you. But why do you think that might be? What do you think about it is about Rochester that makes it really work for that kind of collaborative musical experience?
There's something about people who come from the smaller cities. I think you could call it a sort of regional mentality, And I see myself as such a person. I'm not from New York City, I've lived there for nearly half my life, but I'm a small town guy, And what that means is that you feel this sense of, you feel grounded, you feel like part of a community that's larger than yourself. And you also don't have any illusions about being like God's gift to anything, You're like, well, this isn't bad for Fairport High School. Like, it's that kind of thing. This is pretty good for Rochester. Yeah, go team. It's that mentality, which is like, it's actually very teaching at Harvard is kind of the opposite, I have to say, in a way that I find toxic, that I have to always sort of break down for people, for students and colleagues, like, just because everyone says you're the best at something, that doesn't make it true. And you have to kind of just take this toxic bestness off the table, because you can't, where do you go from there, as an artist, I'm about growth and about transformation and about learning, not about, you can't treat this, a place like this, as like this terminus where, like, okay, you made it. You're done. Life is long, and you want to keep evolving. So I think maybe just having the very normal, just being so normal, like being in such a normal place, and then living with that reality, like, okay, we're just normal folks, who get to do cool things and try to do better every day. That to me, I mean, it's, and I hope that doesn't sound like a diss, because it's not. It's actually like, it's how most of the world is, you know.
Yeah. I love that. That's a wonderful answer. Next thing I have for you, we went down an incredible list of projects you're working on. You're always working on something new. You're often working on multiple new things all at once. And we talked about some of your big picture goals as an artist, some things you want to accomplish sort of emotionally and philosophically. But I do pose this to every interviewee, of course. You can answer this one of two ways. What would you want your next feather in your cap to be? Or if you had to pick one thing to say, I want to accomplish this before I hang it up, retire, go on to the next plane of existence, whatever it would be, this would be it. So either next feather in your cap or final big accomplishment. Either one you want to comment on, go ahead.
The funny thing is that because I came into a life in the arts kind of late, I never treated it like, okay, I'm gonna show them. I'm gonna conquer the world. It was never that. It was always like, wow, I get to do this, They're gonna let me do this. People are gonna buy tickets to this, like they want to buy this album, they want to write about, this kind of stuff. Like, it all just feels like a blessing to me. And then I can't remember who said it. It may be Duke Ellington. Someone asked him, what's your favorite? What you've written so much music, what's your favorite one? And he said, the next one. You always, I think he even said something like, you always have a soft spot for the baby in the family, So it's kind of the care that you put into, like, whatever you are trying to be present for, or whoever you're trying to be present for, how you show up to whatever you're working on and making that matter most of all. That's a very different mentality than, oh, I can't wait to have my premiere at the Metropolitan Opera. I'm going to make that happen. There are such people who think that way. Even, like, you've probably seen that it was Bruce Lee who, like, wrote down his goals, going to become an internationally known kung fu star. He said that. He wrote that down. Then it happened. Or, like, Octavia Butler, the author, she did something like that too. You can see her very early in her life. She sort of set down her goals and then she lived them. So there is that. But in a way, I'm already living them. I feel like I'm blessed and fortunate to be where I am, and just want it to continue as long as I'm able.
Wonderful. And our last one, we've touched upon a lot of these themes already. Early on, we asked you about what the lecture is, which in short can be construed as advice for artists. But again, I always end with this one. Do you have any advice for aspiring artists?
Well, the main thing is, tell the truth. that's what an artist does, be completely honest with yourself and do the work to go in deep. And then also just keep studying, your if you just, what I'd tell young piano players, for example, who are trying to write their own music is like, if you just rummage around on the piano in the same way that you always have, then you're not going to find anything that you haven't already found. You'll just find variations on what you already know. So how do you reach into the unknown? That's the question. What are the questions that you want to ask yourself that will help you do that? And how do you cultivate those kinds of guiding questions that will sustain you for your whole lifetime? So that's the real challenge. And lastly, like, learn about the world, understand where you are in it, and think about what you might have to contribute to the planet and to its people.